Hello friends, I am Professor Smita Jha from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee, and I'm floating a course on health and disability in humanities. And under this caption, I'm going to deliver a talk on germ theory in health and disability humanities. Prior to this, I have already discussed Crip theory in disability and also in health humanities. So let us know what is germ theory. Germ theory shifted the medical world from moral and environmental blame to a biological model of disease. In the health and disability humanities, scholars critique how this shift inadvertently created the modern medical model of disability. This paradigm often reframes natural human variations as defects or pathologies that must be eliminated, cured, or institutionalized. Integrating disability studies with the health humanities reveals how germ theory reshaped societal attitude towards body, mind, and capability. Germ theory is the foundational scientific principle in medicine, stating that infectious diseases are caused by microscopic organisms called pathogen or germs. This include bacteria, virus, fungi, protozoa, and prion. When these organisms invade multiply and grow within a host organism, they disrupt normal physiological functions and cause illness. The acceptance of germ theory in the late 19th century completely revolutionized human life. It moved medicine out of speculative philosophy and into hard science, saving countless lives through modern sanitation, surgical sterilization, vaccines, and antibiotics. In the medical humanities, germ theory is evaluated not merely as a milestone of biological discovery, but as a dominant cultural narrative that reshaped how humanity views the body, selfhood, and social order. Medical humanities scholars deconstruct germ theory to show how an obsession with invisible pathogens redefined human relationships, political power, and the meaning of health. Analyzing germ theory through this humanistic lens uncovers its profound societal relevance across several critical dimensions. First, constructing the modern self and the clean body. The fragmented body, before germ theory, health was an internal holistic balance, humoral theory, or an environmental harmony, that is, miasma theory. Germ theory reframed the human body as an organic fortress under constant siege by external micro invaders, fundamentally changing the human psychological relationship with nature. You might wonder then what life was like before germ theory. For thousands of years, humans had no concept of microscopic pathogens. Instead, medicine was dominated by two primary explanations for disease. The first is humoral theory, formulated by ancient Greek physician Hippocrates. This theory asserted that the human body was filled with four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an internal imbalance of these fluids caused by diet or climate. Second, miasma theory. This theory held that diseases were transmitted by bad air, miasma, filled with noxious vapors arising from rotting organic matter, sewage, and stagnant water. Because all smells were disease, epidemics were blamed on local environmental filth rather than contagious human to human contact. Germ theory from moral sinner to biological vector. Now, under this topic, let us see that what germ theory is. Before germ theory, illness was often viewed as a divine punishment or an environmental imbalance, that is, miasma. Germ theory shifted the medical paradigm to a purely mechanical external cause. A microbe enters a host. However, cultural stigma adapted immediately to this new science, the new label. Instead of being labeled sinful or spiritually corrupt, sick individuals were rebranded as unclean vectors of transmission or biohazards. The illusion of science says that because of this new vocabulary was rooted in legitimate medical science, it made social banishment and discrimination appear rational, objective, and necessary for public safety rather than a byproduct of prejudice. The chronological history of germ theory says that the transition from foul air to microscopic pathogens was a slow, century long process marked by heavy skepticism. The first one is early speculation, 16th to 17th century. In 1546, Italian scholar Girolamo Frascastro published a treatise suggesting that diseases were caused by transferable invisible seeds of disease seminaria passed from person to person. In 1677, Dutch scientist Antony van Leeuwenhoek invented a high magnification microscope and became the first person to see live microorganisms, which he called animalcules. However, nobody connected these tiny creatures to actual illness for nearly 2 centuries. Second one is the pioneers of infection control in the mid 19th century. Before germ theory was formally proven, early medical rebels noticed that cleanliness prevented death. 1840s, a Hungarian physician, Ignaz Semmelweis, noticed mothers were dying of childhood fever at catastrophic rates. He demanded that doctors wash their hands in a chlorinated lime solution before delivering babies, which dropped mortality rates from 18% to less than 2%. Tragically, his peers rejected his findings and mocked his ideas. In 1854, that is during a London cholera outbreak, physician John Snow mapped cases and traced the source of the infection to a contaminated public water pump on Broad Street. While he did not identify the specific bacteria, he proved cholera was waterborne, dealing a massive blow to the miasma theory. Third one is the Provers, Pasteur and Koch, 1860s and 1880s. The ultimate scientific proof of germ theory rests on the shoulders of two rival scientists. First one is Louis Pasteur, disproving a spontaneous generation. In the 1860s, French chemist Louis Pasteur proved that microorganisms caused fermentation and decay. Using his famous swan naked flask experiment, he demonstrated that boiled broth remained sterile unless exposed to airborne dust particle carrying microbes. This completely disproved a spontaneous generation, the ancient belief that life could randomly spawn from non living matter. Pasteur proved that germs exist in the environment and reproduce. Joseph Lister, antiseptic surgery inspired by Pasteur, British surgeon Joseph Lister reasoned that atmospheric germs cause surgical wounds to rot. In 1865, he introduced carbolic acid, phenol, to sterilize surgical instruments and wash wounds, massively reducing post-surgery infections. Robert Koch, the smoking gun in 1876, German physician Robert Koch definitively proved that a specific microbe caused a specific disease. Studying anthrax in cattle, he isolated the bacteria, grew them in a lab, injected them into healthy mice, and observed them contract anthrax. The core scientific response by germ theory. So, germ theory provides the immediate, actionable roadmap when a new infectious threat emerges. Pathogen isolation. Labs rapidly isolate the specific microbe, virus, bacteria, or fungus causing the outbreak, mapping its genetic sequence to confirm it is the source of the disease. Transmission mechanisms. It says that scientists use germ theory to determine how the pathogen spreads, whether through airborne droplets, aerosols, and surface contact, formats, or bodily fluids. So, targeted therapeutics says that understanding the biology of the germ allows for the rapid development of diagnostic PCR tests, antiviral treatments, and vaccines designed to trigger an immune response against that specific pathogen. The legacy of eugenics and fed bodies in relation to germ theory says that hygiene and social worth in the late 19th and early 20th century, germ theory intersected heavily with the eugenics movement. Cleanliness was equated with biological fitness, and disabled, chronically ill, or neurodivergent individuals were frequently stereotyped as unclean or a drain on the genetic health of the population. Some of the important ideas related to the interrelation between contagion and disability are deinstitutionalization, the obsession with containment and quarantine born from early germ theory logic justified the mass institutionalization of disabled individuals under the guise of public hygiene and safety. The Crip time of chronic illness, acute versus chronic framework. Germ theory is built around an acute illness narrative, exposure, infection, crisis, and cure or death. Disability humanities critique this because it fails to accommodate chronic illness, autoimmune conditions, or long term disabilities. Scholars often use the term crib time to describe how disabled and chronically ill individuals navigate a world structured around rigid, able bodied timelines of immediate recovery and capitalist productivity. Immunity as capital. So, germ theory creates a cultural hierarchy where a strong, self depending immune system is viewed as a personal moral virtue. Those with compromised immune system or dynamic disabilities are often sidelined or forced into involuntary isolation to survive. Ableism in pandemic metaphors that highlights the disposability in public health. Modern global health crisis expose deep-seated ableism. Public health mechanisms during outbreaks often rationalize deaths by stating victims had underlying health condition, which disability scholars argue treat disabled and elderly lives as acceptable collateral damage. Coming to germ theory in the context of pandemic. And really, germ theory is very, very important in the context of pandemic. So during a pandemic, germ theory serves as the foundational scientific framework used to identify, track, contain, and treat the spreading pathogen. However, the pandemic also exposes the limits of a strict biological germ theory, forcing public health systems to integrate it with environmental, social, and political strategies to manage a crisis. Some of the limitations are that the return of environmental context. While classic 19th century germ theory focused strictly on microbe, kill the germ, a pandemic shifts focus towards the environment where the germ spreads, echoing aspects of old miasma era concern, but with modern engineering, this includes aerosols and ventilation. Pandemics like COVID 19 highlighted that killing surface germs is not enough. Public health heavily emphasizes indoor air quality, air changes per hour ACH, HEPA filtration, and ultraviolet light disinfection. Overcrowding. Germ theory proves that dense, poorly ventilated spaces act as accelerators for viral application and transmission, making structural housing and workplace environments critical public health vectors. The re emergence of social and moral stigma, even though germ theory proved that diseases are biological rather than moral failure, pandemics historically trigger a regression into blaming specific groups of people. Xenophobia and othering. Because germs are invisible, societies during a pandemic often map the fear of the microbe onto visible groups, leading to the stigmatization of specific nationalities, immigrants, or marginalized communities as vectors of disease. Xenophobia as sanitation. Because microbes are invisible, societies historically projected the physical fear of germs onto visible human targets. Scholars use post colonial and cultural theories to track how outbreaks routinely trigger the othering of immigrant populations, minority groups, or the poor, falsely conflating social vulnerability with biological impurity. The virtuous immune system pandemic often create a cultural divide where staying healthy is viewed as a personal moral triumph of a strong immune system, while those who get severely ill or are immunocompromised face subtle blame for biological vulnerability. Coming to biosecurity and state control, under germ theory, the human body is viewed as a potential host that can replicate and pass on a dangerous pathogen. During a pandemic, this justifies government intervention. The logic of containment. Governments use the mathematics of germ replication, like the RO value, to justify lockdowns, mandatory quarantines, border closure, and masking mandate. Individual versus collective liberty. Health, humanities, and political scientists analyze how pandemic policies test the limits of personal freedom as the state treats individual bodies as collective biosecurity risk that must be regulated to protect the healthcare system. Coming to the biopolitics and the surveillance state, the rise of biopower, applying the theories of Michel Foucault, scholars show how germ theory provided governments with a powerful mandate to regulate individual bodies in the name of collective biosecurity. Justifying control says that the mathematical reality of contagion justified sweeping state interventions such as mandatory quarantines, compulsory vaccinations, and border tracking. Medical humanity question whether public safety ends and the infringement of personal civil liberties begins. Entrenching the rigid medical model, the acute illness bias, germ theory established a triumphant narrative blueprint: exposure, identification of the pathogen, deployment of magic bullet, antibiotic and vaccine, and total care. Marginalizing chronic illness, so disability humanities scholars point out that this rigid framework isolates individuals with chronic autoimmune or post-viral conditions like long COVID. Because these conditions do not fit the need one germ, one cure model, patients often face medical gaslighting or systemic abandonment. Transition of the post pandemic microbiome. As a pandemic transitions into an endemic phase, the scientific narrative often shifts from total eradication to coexistence. Eradication versus management, except for rare cases like smallpox, eliminating a highly contagious pandemic pathogen is nearly impossible. The birth of hypervigilance, everyday behaviors, shaking hands, kissing, sharing food, were suddenly reinterpreted as dangerous vectors of infection. The humanities analyze how this birthed modern domestic hygiene standards, transforming cleanliness from a spiritual virtue into a strict biological duty. The language of warfare and stigmatization using military metaphors. Medical humanities critique how germ theory infused clinical medicine with combative language, fighting infection, attacking viruses, defending host immunity. This linguistic framework pressure tests patient experiences, subtly suggesting that succumbing to an illness represents a personal tactical failure. Ecological thinking says that modern public health increasingly uses a One Health approach, which looks at how human health, animal health, and ecosystem disruption like deforestation, driving, zoonotic spillover interact to create pandemics in the first place. So let us discuss more about this important aspect. From eradication to ecological thinking, the post pasture paradigm. And it says that for over a century, the cultural mandate of germ theory was total eradication via sterilization. Contemporary health humanities track the massive cultural shift toward the human microbiome, re-entangling the human, while recognizing that trillions of microbes are essential for human survival, forces medicine to move away from adversarial warfare metaphors. It encourages an ecological model of health based on symbiotic balance, coexistence, and environmental care. Intersectional of germ theory and narrative medicine within health humanities. And the intersection of germ theory and narrative medicine focuses on how the biological discovery of microscopic pathogens transform the way illness stories are told, understood, and structurally framed. While germ theory provides a mechanical, linear explanation of disease transmission, narrative medicine developed by Rita Sharon championed the messy, subjective lived experience of the patient. When these two concepts collide in the medical humanities, they expose a deep tension between objective laboratory data and human storytelling. Some of the common narratives in this context are the creation of the battle narrative, the clinical blueprint, which is germ theory introduced a highly linear, dramatic plot arc into medicine. An external villain, the pathogen, invades a host, causing an acute crisis that must be fought off with modern medical weapons, that is, antibiotic and vaccines. The narrative medicine critique says that narrative medicine analyzes how this warfare framework shapes patient language. It critiques how patients who do not recover from an infection or who suffer from long term complications are subtly framed by this language as having lost their battle, placing an unfair psychological burden on the individual. Coming to the conflict of the two histories, the bacteriological chart says that under the influence of germ theory, a patient's medical history became heavily quantified. Success is measured by lab cultures, viral loads, and PCR test results. The lived experience says that narrative medicine bridges the gap between this objective data and the patient's subjective story. It highlights how a chart noting pathogen cleared often fails to capture the ongoing trauma, social isolation, or chronic fatigue that lingers long after the biological germ is gone. Speaking of contagion, stigma, and the unreliable narrator, the fear of the invisible. Now, because germs are invisible to the naked eye, historical outbreaks like cholera, tuberculosis, or HIV/AIDS quickly bred paranoia and moral panic. Restoring the voice. During epidemics, the voices of infected individuals are frequently silenced, heavily policed, or dismissed as dangerous or unreliable. Narrative medicine functions as a tool of resistance, using patients' diaries, poetry, and memoirs to humanize those who have been pathologized and reduced to mere vectors of disease by public health system. The challenges of post viral and chronic illness. So, one germ, one cure. And the limitation is classic germ theory relies on a neat diagnostic loop: find the microbe, kill the microbe, cure the patient. And the narrative void is that this model fails spectacularly for post viral syndromes like long COVID or myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. Narrative medicine offers a framework for patients to articulate illness that lack a neat, visible bacteriological smoking gun, validating conditions that strict laboratory metrics might otherwise gaslight or dismiss. Memoirs as counter narrative in the health humanities, analyzing germ theories alongside literary memoirs of infectious illness reveals how first person storytelling can challenge, humanize, or complicate scientific facts. While biological germ theory reduces an outbreak to a cold sequence of pathogen transmission, cellular replication, and clinical cure, a memoir documents what it actually feels like to be an isolated host in a hypervigilant world. When viewed together, memoirs function as a crucial counter narrative to strict laboratory data, dismantling the clean scientific binary. The clinical expectation says that early germ theory advanced a rigid binary outcome. A patient gets infected, the body either eradicates the microbe or dies, and recovery means returning to a neat baseline. The memoirist counterpoint. Modern infectious illness memoirs frequently expose the myth of this binary. In works like Megan O. Roorkee, The Invisible Kingdom, writers detail how pathogens can permanently alter the immune system. They trace long haul autoimmune conditions or post viral fatigue syndromes that linger long after the initial germ has vanished from lab charts. Humanizing the vector of disease. The biosecurity estate, under pandemic protocols governed by germ theory, public health entities must view human beings as biological threats or vectors of transmission that must be tracked and isolated. The memoirist counterpoint during the peak of HIV and AIDS epidemic, texts like Paul Monti's Borrowed Time and AIDS memoir serve as direct pushback against clinical language. Monty utilized storytelling to reclaim the dignity, intimacy, and humanity of queer patients who were being heavily stigmatized by early medical systems as mere agents of contamination, exposing the trauma of the sanitized fortress, the pure space. Germ theory dictates the physical separation of the clean from the unclean. This logic underpins the architecture of modern hospitals, sanatoriums, and quarantine centers. The memorized counterpoint, literature detailing life inside a sanitarium, such as Franz Kafka's late diaries during his battle with tuberculosis, focuses heavily on psychological impact of institutional sanitization. Memoirists articulate how an obsession with avoiding micropenetration breeds profound existential loneliness, shifting the focus from physical healing to mental isolation. Deconstructing medical metaphors, the language of war. As discussed earlier, germ theory introduced a pervasive military vocabulary into the clinic, framing white blood cells as defender and viruses as invader. The memorized counterpoint is that in her foundational health humanities work, illness as metaphor, cancer survivor Susan Sontag argued that mapping political warfare onto microscopic biology deeply harms the patient. She demonstrated through literary analysis that these metaphors burden patients with a false sense of personal responsibility, suggesting that failing to recover is equivalent to a tactical military defeat. With this in mind, let us turn to the germ theory paradigm and the related concepts that have shaped the widespread use of warfare metaphors in medicine. So, the medical humanities critique why metaphor matters. Health humanities scholars deconstruct these military metaphors to show that language is never neutral. Framing healthcare as war has profound, often damaging consequences for patient psychology and public policy. Shifting blame to the patient. When recovery is framed as battle, the outcome of disease is subtly linked to the patient's willpower. If an infection worsens or becomes chronic, the subtext of the military metaphor implies that the patient lost their fight or gave up. This creates an unfair psychological burden of guilt, shame, and perceived weakness for individuals dealing with severe infections or long haul illness. Naturalizing total deconstruction. In warfare, collateral damage is acceptable to achieve total victory. When clinicians adopt a scorched earth military mindset to kill the germ, it can lead to overly aggressive treatment that severely damage the patient's overall ecosystem, such as the widespread deconstruction of the beneficial gut microbiome through the systemic over prescription of antibiotic, warfare metaphors, and the justification of authoritarian public policy. During pandemics, governments actively weaponize the military metaphor to declare a war on the virus. By treating an invisible germ as an enemy combatant, a state can easily justify wartime measures, such as strict lockdowns, heavy surveillance, broader closures, and the suspension of civil liberties, positioning public health as a matter of national security rather than social care. It also contributes to fueling xenophobia and othering. Because a virus cannot be seen, the military metaphor requires a visible enemy. Historically, societies have projected the image of the foreign invader onto marginalized human groups. This was evident when early germ theory was used to justify colonial segregation during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, when marginalized communities were treated as biological threats, and during the COVID 19 pandemic with the rise of anti Asian xenophobia. The paradigm shift from warfare to ecology. Modern health humanities and progressive medical practices are actively pushing to replace the military metaphor with ecological metaphors. Instead of viewing the body as a fortress at war, contemporary science increasingly views the human body as an ecosystem or a garden. Health is redefined not as the total eradication of all external entities, but as the cultivation of symbiotic balance, biodiversity, and peaceful coexistence within the human microbiome. Furthermore, in the health and medical humanities, the immune system is analyzed not just as a complex biological network of cells and organs, but as a rich cultural, political, and philosophical concept. It serves as the primary boundary marker that defines whether the self ends and the world begins. The philosophical definition of the self, the biological baseline, says that in traditional immunology, the primary function of the immune system is described as self versus non self discrimination. The body must recognize its own healthy cells, that is, self, and destroy foreign pathogens like bacteria or viruses, that is, non self. The humanistic critique says that philosophers of medicine argue that this framework creates an ultra individualistic view of human nature. It portrays the body as an isolated paranoid entity constantly policing its borders against the outside world rather than a connected organism that exists in constant healthy dialogue with its environment. Metaphor of the fortress and the border patrol to describe immunity. So, spatial metaphors. Textbooks and media heavily rely on spatial and architectural metaphors to explain immunity. The skin is a fortress wall, mucous membranes are barriers, and white blood cells like macrophages and T cells act as a roaming border patrol or security force. Socio-political parallel, and it says that health humanities scholars trace how these descriptions fluctuate during times of geopolitical tension. For example, during the immigration debates of the late 20th and the early 21st century, the language used to describe national border security heavily borrowed from immunology, while public health messaging conversely described immune defenses using national security terminology. Another important aspect related to immunity is metaphorization, and its relation to selfhood is the violence of autoimmunity. When the self attack happens, autoimmune diseases like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, or multiple sclerosis occur when the immune system mistakenly identifies the body's own tissues as foreign invaders and attacks them. The narrative crisis highlights that in literary memoirs of chronic illness, autoimmunity presents a profound narrative paradox. The body is simultaneously the victim, the attacker, and the battlefield. Writers use narrative medicine to process this existential betrayal, rejecting the rigid military metaphor because fighting the disease in an autoimmune context literally means fighting oneself. Another aspect is immunity as social and cultural capital. And the virtuous body says that in contemporary wellness culture, having a strong immune system has been elevated to a moral virtue. Boosting immunity through diet, supplements, and lifestyle choices is frequently framed as a personal achievement. The ableist subtext says that disability humanities scholars point out that this framing creates an ableist hierarchy. Those who are immunocompromised, elderly, or dealing with dynamic illness are subtly pathologized as biologically or morally deficient, treating vulnerable bodies as personal failures rather than individuals requiring a structural communal protection. Then there was a shift, an ecological turn from warfare to symbiosis. Modern health humanities track a major paradigm shift away from the purely defensive fortress model towards an ecological model. And the discovery of the human microbiome proves that trillions of foreign microbes are essential for human survival and actively help train our immune response. This led to redefining health. They shift the cultural view of the immune system from an aggressive army designed to eradicate all outsiders to a diplomatic negotiator or a garden curator whose job is to maintain balanced diversity and peaceful coexistence. Having traced the emergence and influence of germ theory, we can now turn to a comparative discussion of how its assumptions diverge from those of Crip theory introduced in the previous lecture. So, what are the differences between germ theory and Crip theory? The primary difference between the two is that germ theory is an objective, laboratory tested biological science that explains how microscopic pathogens cause physical illness. Conversely, Crip theory is a critical humanities framework that analyzes how societal structure and cultural beliefs level certain bodies, minds, or health states as defective or abnormal. Germ theory, that is the medical pathologization, developed by pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, germ theory tracks physical pathology. Microbe centric, it states that diseases are caused by concrete biological agents entering a host. The fix-it mandate, it treats the body like a biological machine. If a pathogen disrupts a function, medicine must deploy an intervention, like antibiotics or vaccine, to force the body back to a strict normal baseline. And the Crip theory, the cultural critic, coined by a scholar like Alison Keffer and drawing heavily from queer theory, Crip theory critiques the medical establishment's power, deconstructing normalcy, and it argues that the concept of a perfectly functioning, hyperproductive body is an artificial social construct. Embracing variations instead of reducing a disabled, chronically ill, or neurodivergent person to a collection of clinical error, Crip theory values bodily variance. It demands that society alter its architecture and timeline to accommodate disabled people rather than forcing disabled people to fix their bodies to fit society. And the following table elaborates this distinction between germ theory and Crip theory more clearly. So the features are that primary field, the problem, the target, and the view time. And germ theory and the primary field is microbiology and clinical medicine, while the Crip theory, disability studies, queer theory, and humanities. Under the feature, the problem, germ theory is microscopic pathogens, bacteria, viruses invading a host, and Crip theory is ableism and a society that refuses to accommodate bodily variety. Under the feature, the target, germ theory is eradicating germs and curing the physical body, while Crip theory is dismantling systemic barriers and redefining normalcy. Under the feature, view of time, germ theory is acute, a structured timeline of infection, crisis, and cure, while Crip theory is the Crip time, a flexible timeline honoring the patient of chronic illness. Now, how they intersect and clash in the humanities. In the health humanities, scholars use Crip theory to interrogate the unintended social consequences of germ theory. So the eradication obsession says that germ theory's massive success in curing acute infection diseases created a society myth that every bodily variation should be wiped out. Crip theory resists this, highlighting the unique cultures and identities within disabled communities. The stigma of contagion, germ theory necessitates quarantine and isolation to preserve physical purity. Crip theory exposes how this logic can morph into systematic ableism, such as viewing immunocompromised individual as expendable collateral damage during global pandemics. So let us discuss more about mechanisms of stigma within germ theory. So the mechanics of stigma under germ theory says that the medical and health humanities scholars identify three distinct ways germ theory alters and accelerates the stigma of contagion. The first is xenophobia and sanitation. Because microbes are invisible to the naked eye, the human mind struggles to fear an abstract entity. Historically, societies project the fear of the invisible germ onto a visible other. During outbreaks, minority group, immigrants, or the poor are routinely demonized as the literal sources of pathogen, framing immigrants as unclean or labeling viruses by geographic location. Next is the virtuous immune system. Germ theory inadvertently created a moral hierarchy based on physical health. Individuals with robust immune system are culturally praised as resilient and disciplined. Conversely, those who contract an infection suffers from chronic past viral condition or are immunocompromised are subtly blamed for possessing a weak or deficit body. Then the violence of isolation. While physical quarantine is a vital public health tool to stop transmission, it inflicts severe psychological and social trauma. Germ theory legitimizes total isolation, causing society to treat the infected person as a biological threat to be locked away rather than a suffering individual in need of communal care. To summarize the discussion thus far, let us review the landmark moments in the formation of germ theory alongside the key theoretical developments that have reshaped health humanities' approaches to health, illness, and disability. So these are the historical case studies in germ theory. The pre-era, which is miasma and humorism, ancient times 1860s, and the belief says that for centuries disease was blamed on miasma, bad air or rotting matter or an imbalance of bodily fluids, humors. The environment, hospitals were filthy, surgeons wore blood-stained apron as badges of honor, and urban cities mixed drinking water with raw sewage. The dawn of the era, the 1860 disapproving a spontaneous generation, and the breakthrough is that French chemist Louis Pasteur launched the germ theory era by proving that microorganisms do not spontaneously spawn from non-living matter. The experiment is that using this famous swan naked flask, he proved that boiled broth remained sterile unless exposed to airborne microbes. This shifted medicine towards an anti-contagionist model, proving that germs come from the environment and reproduce. And the practical shift is that in 1865, British surgeon Joseph Lister applied Pasteur's logic to surgery using carbolic acid to sterilize wounds, an instrument causing post-operative mortality rates to plummet. Tuberculosis, the 19th century shift before Robert Koch isolated the TB bacteria, consumption was romanticized in literature as an artistic, spiritual affliction. The moment it was proven to be a contagious germ, the romanticized narrative vanished. TB patients were instantly stigmatized, driven out of cities, and forced into isolated sanitariums. The HIV/AIDS crisis, the blame hybrid. HIV represents the ultimate intersection of biological contagion and moral stigma. Because the virus was initially linked to marginalized groups, early public health responses focus heavily on policing the identities of the patients rather than the mechanics of the virus itself, causing decades of internalized shame and systematic medical neglect. COVID-19 aerosols and Asian diaspora. The recent pandemic demonstrated how rapidly germ theory can be weaponized into racial stigma. The physical reality of a respiratory virus was immediately mapped onto geopolitical anxieties, resulting in global surges of xenophobia and violence against East Asia communities. With this, I wrap up the discussion. Thank you.